The term existentialism was coined about 30 years ago, initially mainly to refer to a couple of German philosophers about whom I shall talk hardly at all in the series of 3 lectures, namely Karl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger. It was, however, only after World War II that through the writings of the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialism became very well known and very much talked about all over the world, and quite especially in the United States too. Although there is a good deal of interest in it and it's very much discussed, there is no complete agreement about just what existentialism means, about just what it refers to. It might be foolish for me to say, here is what exactly it means, but it is surely essential for me, if I want to give 3 lectures about it, to tell you how I am going to use the term. I'm going to use it as a label to refer to a number of people who are usually meant by the term, and these would be quite particularly Søren Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Jaspers and Jean-Paul Sartre. I'll say something about Nietzsche in a few minutes, seeing that the second lecture will be largely devoted to Nietzsche. Now, why use the term existentialism as such a label instead of using the word, rather giving a clear-cut definition of it? There's one existentialist who tried to give a definition of it. Sartre said that existentialism was the doctrine that teaches that existence precedes essence. There are a number of things that are bad about this definition. The first one is, and this in itself isn't crucial, that it's terribly unclear, that it's even harder to understand what it means that existence precedes essence than it's to understand, quite apart from that, what existentialism might be. The second reason for not accepting this definition, which after all perhaps could be explained, is that no sooner had Sartre said that in a lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, then Heidegger published a letter on humanism in which he said, if that's existentialism, I'm not an existentialist. And along came Jaspers and said, count me out too. And if we look back, for example, to Kierkegaard, for example, to Nietzsche, or if we take a sidelong glance at Camus, it seems clear that these other men would not accept this particular definition either. Now one might see, is there some other definition that we can impose on the lot of them? And it doesn't seem to me to be a particularly fruitful undertaking. We might perhaps later in this course of lectures look back afterwards and see whether some one definition comes to mind. Meanwhile, I don't have a bad conscience at all about just using it as such a label. There are any number of other labels that we use in a similar way. For example, when we speak of American pragmatism, what are we doing but simply using some sort of shorthand device to refer all at once to Peirce and James and Dewey, perhaps also to Mead, perhaps also to one or another person who comes to mind. But we don't work with any very clear-cut definition, and if we happen to be close students of any 2 of these men, say of James and Dewey or of James and Peirce, then the more we read them, the more we become aware of the fact that they really don't agree with each other at all, that there are very important points on which they disagree with each other. And still it's useful sometimes to discuss them together because there are some family resemblances between them. There are certain ways in which they belong recognizably together rather than belong with other groups. Similarly, when we speak of continental rationalists, as we sometimes do in philosophy courses, then we mean Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, and as we study them, we find that they violently disagreed with each other on points that mattered deeply to them. I'll just give one more such example, namely British empiricism. Another such label, it refers to Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and if we examine them closely, we find, for example, that Locke was a deist, that Berkeley was a bishop, and that Hume was, to be polite about it, an agnostic. So there were certainly very many things about which these three disagreed with each other, and they criticized each other, and still there are some things that Locke, Berkeley, and Hume sort of seem to have in common, even if it's a little difficult to say what precisely it is, and that distinguishes them from the rationalists or from the pragmatists. So there's nothing unusual about using the term existentialism as a label for a group of people and then sort of as an afterthought asking ourselves, now what are the traits that they have in common? Now the traits that they have in common are, first of all, that the men that we usually call existentialists are all of them very radical individualists. And this is what makes it so hard to pin them all down to a common platform. They're all men who have very much a mind of their own and to make a point of going it alone. In fact, part of whose common outlook is that there is something wrong with schools of philosophy, that there is something wrong with drafting some kind of a platform, that there is something wrong with philosophic systems. They are people who, in a phrase that Nietzsche once used in Zarathustra, like only what a man has written with his blood. In other words, stuff that doesn't come from the brain alone, but rather stuff in which a man is engaged as an entire personality with all his experience. This is the sort of thing they're like. And if a man tries to transpose into prose all of his experience, then seeing that his experience and his character is bound to be different from somebody else's, there will be a distinctive individual quality to his writing which distinguishes him from the other men. And so, as we take up in these three lectures three different men, we will find that everyone has very much a style of his own and a character of his own and a mode of thinking of his own. Positively, we can say that one further thing that they have in common is a concern with extreme situations, extreme experiences, the most intense experiences, the most extraordinary experiences, and in the narrower sense, we might say the less happy experiences. When I say in a narrower sense, this leaves out to some extent Nietzsche, who is certainly a borderline figure, a very doubtful candidate for existentialism. What he has in common with the other existentialists is that he too is particularly interested in ultimate experiences, but unlike most of the other existentialists, he does not emphasize so exclusively, to cite the titles of some of Kierkegaard's books, fear and trembling, and the sickness unto death which is despair, and the concept of dread, and going beyond Kierkegaard now, the experience of the anticipation in thought of one's own death. On the whole, the existentialists are particularly preoccupied with the gloomier experiences, but at any rate with the most dramatic, with the most tragic experiences. This, of course, in large measure accounts for the intelligent person's interest in existentialism and accounts for the fact that even people who find most current philosophy not particularly interesting feel that when it comes to existentialism, there is something here that's of concern to them, because existentialists do talk about experiences about which it is difficult to be indifferent. Experiences that matter to all of us and that engage our interest if they are written about with any sensitivity and intelligence at all. What is implicit in what I have said so far is that if the question is raised, for example, was Pascal an existentialist, or was Albert Camus an existentialist, there is no right or wrong answer here. All we can say is, well, there are certain things that these men have in common with people usually called existentialists, and then we can see, are there also some things that distinguish them from the other existentialists? In what respects are they like other members of the family? In what respects are they different? Certainly we must not make up our minds on the basis of whether they like each other. It so happens that most of the living existentialists dislike each other quite intensely, but that happens in some families too, and that's no proof that somebody doesn't belong to the family. On the contrary, precisely people who have much in common with each other and who have inherited some of the same traits sometimes find each other particularly trying. And that applies to existentialists too. A further implication of what I have said is that it would not be proper to say that existentialism is a synonym for modern philosophy. There are some modern philosophers, especially French and German ones, though not only French and German ones, who are existentialists, but there are also many other modern philosophers, including most modern English-speaking philosophers, who are not existentialists. The existentialists are those who share these traits that I have talked about, who are so individualistic, who are impatient with things that are remote from life, who deal with dramatic experiences. Now, how shall we relate existentialism to what I have called the modern crisis? That there are all sorts of crises in our time is surely not controversial. Unquestionably, our time is a time of crisis. But I do not mean to imply right from the start, without having examined the matter at all, that our time is uniquely a time of crisis. About this, I would like temporarily to suspend judgment. So if one or the other of you should feel that perhaps every time is a time of crisis, or at least that there have been many other times that have been just as critical as our time, we needn't argue about this at all. We needn't have any difference about this at all. All that I want to say is that there are some crises in our time, and what I want to do is to relate existentialism to three such crises in our time: the one in religion today, the one in philosophy next week, the one in morality 2 weeks from today, and then we can see each time to what extent each of these three crises is uniquely modern, or to what extent it is perhaps a perpetual crisis.